Good evening, friends. I'm your host, Victor Crimson, and welcome once again to Tormented Tales, where we share stories that are both truly terrifying and terrifyingly true. Tonight's horrid little morsels concern the simple act of camping, an activity that can be both invigorating and relaxing, and of course, sometimes terrifying. Before we jump into our campfire tales of guy ropes and tents, however, a quick reminder before we start to hit that subscribe button to ensure that you don't miss out on any of our future collections. And as always, if you'd like to submit your own true tale of terror for us to read out, send them along to the address in the description below. Our first story comes from Clint in Canada, a place with a great deal of unspoiled wilderness and no doubt a great number of wilder things living deep within it. Fools and food. In the part of Canada where I live, the locals have a saying when talking about camping in the forests. Listening to some city slickers talking about their plans and how they're not too worried about things like bears and wolves, a local will often respond with the phrase, "Fool is only a letter away from food, because if you're a fool out here, that's what you become." The meaning behind this phrase is fairly simple. If you go camping out here without giving the forest and the things that live in it the proper respect, it will very quickly teach you some manners. It's difficult sometimes for folks raised in the cities where the only large predators are locked up in zoos to really understand. Out here, those things are wild. There are things in those forests that will hunt, kill, and eat a man without thinking twice. The stupid and ill-prepared quickly learn these lessons, but often don't live long enough to act upon them. I have always been aware of these facts. I refuse to go anywhere near the forest unless I have everything I think I need, know exactly where I'm going, and feel as if I'm adequately prepared. Or at least, that used to be the case. Now I don't go into the forest at all. Problem is, you see, there are some things out there that no amount of planning will prepare you for, and that guns will not protect you from. As I said, there are things out there that will hunt a man. Not all of them are animals. For me, solo camping was always as thrilling as it was relaxing. You would literally swing between the two extremes. At times, the process would be challenging and stressful because you had to race against the sun to pitch your tent and build your fire before the fire in the sky took its warmth away. Often getting to your spot and setting up could be difficult and arduous. Once you did get settled, though, the reward was indescribable. The quiet, the isolation, and the peace of being alone in nature is not a thing you can easily sum up in words. It has to be experienced. It was exactly that feeling of distant tranquility, of being the only person for miles around, that I was seeking when I set out last December. Unfortunately, that plan was scuppered around halfway toward my favorite camping spot. The man's voice had a shrill, nasal quality to it that was no doubt exaggerated to the point of being gratingly irritated when it was heard against a background of near silence. He called to me from somewhere further up the trail with a shout of, "Ahoy!" like we were ships on some strange sea of trees. He hurried to join me on the trail, and despite my obvious reluctance, proceeded to walk beside me for the next 3 or 4 miles, all the while whittering away about how this was his first time solo camping, how he'd shelled out for only the best, top-of-the-range gear, and how, from what he'd read, I might be in for a very uncomfortable night with my cheaper and far more battered equipment. I forced up a smile and assured him I'd be fine, my equipment having seen me through more than a few nights in the cold over the years. He brushed off these assurances and offered me his business card, adding that if I got into difficulties in the night, I could always call him, as he would surely be staying not far from me. This of course ignored the fact that he had not a chance of getting a signal out here, but I took the offer in the spirit it was intended and assured him that should I get into difficulties, I would definitely give him a call. As it turned out, it was him who called for me, though not with the aid of a phone. The scream broke the silence at around 2 a.m. We had separated hours earlier once I had about enough of his chatter, and since then, I had been left mercifully to my own devices. I had pitched my tent, eaten my evening meal, and climbed into my sleeping bag with only the fresh and icy chill for company. I remember, as I climbed in, I sighed in satisfaction at the prospect of a good night's sleep. Though of course, it didn't turn out that way. Hearing the screams and the desperate panicked cries for help, I couldn't simply stay put. Annoying as my unwanted friend might have been, I could not leave him to his fate, and instead rushed from my tent, rifle in hand, in the hope of catching him and whatever was panicking him in good time before the fool became the food. I ran headlong into the darkness and the trees, my torch in one hand and my gun in the other, looking all about me as I did and trying to gauge from the screams that continued to ring out which direction in which to run. As I moved ever deeper into the trees, I heard how the nature of the screams changed, from calls of terror and appeals for help to cries, I thought, of pain. Rushing as quickly as I could along the pitch-black network of paths, toward the sounds growing ever and ever louder and closer, I came, all at once, to an abrupt stop. I had expected to come across a fire, a tent, and perhaps animals, a bear, a wolf, or, God forbid, a pack of them. What I saw instead, only for a fraction of a second, glimpsed in the halo of my torchlight, was worse than anything I might have imagined. You see, once I got close, the screams stopped being around or before me. All at once, I realized that the noise was instead above me. Throwing the torchlight upwards, I saw for just a moment, 30 feet above me and moving swiftly from left to right, feet. A pair of feet, wrapped in expensive-looking hiking boots, dangled high in the treetops. The rest of the body was out of sight, disappearing into the branches and no doubt the clutches of whatever diabolical thing was holding him. As I watched, the legs hung there, at first kicking in strange, awkward spasms. Then, all at once, they stopped. So did the screams. For a second, they stayed there, like tights or pants on a washing line, suspended in the air until very slowly they were eased and fed carefully upward toward the blackness and branches above. I wish I could say that I fought for that man, that I charged forward, guns blazing, and shot dead whatever had taken him. I wish I could say that, but I can't. I did shoot several times into the darkness, but then I turned and ran. When I got back to town, I reported what I'd seen. A party went out looking, and the man's gear was found, perfectly intact and untouched. There was no sign of the man himself. There never has been. After that, I stopped going to the forest. Even now, I find it hard to deal with the guilt. The fact that I was unable to save or even help him. My only consolation, the only thing I can tell myself to ease the guilt a little, is to remember that charging forwards, towards whatever it was that took him, would have been foolhardy, and of course, in this part of the world, we all know what fools become. So what do you think? An animal, a cryptid, or one of those older legends come around again to feed? Let us know what you think in the comments below. But remember, for some people it's considered bad luck to say the word Wendigo out loud. Our second story was submitted by Neil in Scotland and concerns things that do not prowl around your tent at night, but rather, well, you'll see, the sleeper. Most times, when I hear people telling stories of their horrific camping experiences, the stories follow a similar template. You know the sort of things I mean. The person telling the story goes off into the woods, usually after being warned about some strange goings-on, or about some creature they need to be careful of. They set up camp, wait for the dark, and sit by the fire with the blackness all around them. There's usually some line about the trees seeming to move in about them, and then they hear a sound. Sometimes there's a different version, where the person is inside their tent already. They have usually already been asleep when they hear the sound of branches snapping somewhere outside, the snuffling and rustle of footsteps as something large begins to slowly circle the tent. I have personally sat across from people who have told me of how they've seen the shadows projected onto the canvas of their tents, or seen the material bow inwards as some creature leans against it, trying to find an entrance or a way into the tent to get at the meat it can smell inside. Meat that at the time happens to still be attached to the teller's bones. My story isn't like that. There was no snap of twigs, no breaking of branches or suspicion that there might be something out there. I was camping in Scotland. The largest predators we have are badgers and foxes, hardly a danger to any human being, and seriously unlikely to approach a campsite. Honestly, if I had heard steps around my tent or seen the material bow inward, I would have been more worried that it was somebody than something. Still, there wasn't much of a chance of that. The entire point of my camping trips was to put as much distance between me and other people as possible. For those who don't know or can't visualize what the wilder parts of Scotland are like, I'll save you trying to guess. They are, in a word, remote. Places where, if you know where to go, you can literally wander for days without seeing another soul. I had gone on my trip miles from anywhere, and more importantly, from anyone, with exactly that intention. I was 4 days into my progress along a trail where I would hike by day and camp at night, and in that time, I had seen precisely no one. Had I been doing the trail in summer or even mid-spring, I might have seen a few people, but in late autumn, with the temperatures regularly dipping below freezing and snow threatened, it was as beautifully desolate and isolated as I wanted it to be. The night it happened, I had set up camp in a small, wooded area. I had moved into the trees to avoid the wind that can really bite up in the highlands, and to shield me in case of rain or snow. Luckily, neither had materialized, and so, after a decent meal, I zipped up my tent, climbed into my sleeping bag, and began to enjoy the silence. Now, this is the point at which most stories would veer into cliché. The teller wakes in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps, snapping twigs or grunts and growls from outside the tent. In my case, there was no such thing. What woke me was not footsteps or breaking branches. It was the soft and barely perceptible sound of breathing inside the tent. I suppose I had been asleep, because when I first heard it, I was lying on my back with not a hint of light. At first, I thought perhaps I was dreaming, and I did the classic thing of pinching myself to check, moving my hand very slowly and carefully to my thigh to squeeze hard. I felt it. I was awake, yet the sound continued. A low, labored breathing, inches from my own face. I froze in place, trying frantically to make sense of this. Was it some echo of my own breath? No, because along with the breath, there came the smallest, whispering rustle of fabric. A tiny shift of the material of a sleeping bag rose and fell with each breath, and along with the sound, there was the movement. I could feel the breath moving in and out, because whoever was there lying beside me and breathing in that thick, labored way was spitting a jet of warm, moist breath in my direction, as if they were sleeping on their side and their mouth was only inches from the naked flesh of my cheek. I remained silent. How, I wondered, could anyone have gotten here? How could they have gotten into the tent without me hearing them and laid themselves down beside me, so close that I could feel the pressure of them against my own sleeping bag, the weight of another body touching my own, where there had been no body before. After around a minute, lying in perfect, frozen silence, I decided to move. Slowly, so slowly, that every second seemed to last a minute. I slid my hand, tucked deep into the sleeping bag, up the side of the lining, snaking it slowly out so that I could reach across to grip my torch. Finally, after what seemed like an age, during which time the breathing continued, slow and soft, in and out, I grasped the handle of the torch and flipped the switch. The beam shot not to my right, where I imagined the sleeper to be, but upward, to the top of the tent. Yet it was more than enough light for me to see, in a single instant, everything I needed to see. The tattered remains of a sodden sleeping bag beside me, so close it was actually touching. It was thick with mold and moss and was, I could see, occupied. As my eyes traveled up toward the top of the bag, my own breath seemed to stop. Then I saw it. The face, its lipless mouth a black circle lined with teeth, wide open and breathing in such a way that the tendons, visible where the cheeks should have been, moved up and down like the sails of a ship, catching and losing the wind. The eyes, too, were missing, replaced by the empty black sockets of the long dead. Yet this face, this thing, continued to breathe. Kicking furiously at the sleeping bag, I struggled and fought to get out as quickly as I could. Fumbling with the zip, I opened up the tent and spilled into the night, out into the wood, and completely barefoot, sprinted out into the black. An hour later, I had regained enough of my composure to realize my predicament. If I stayed out there, on the moorland beyond the trees, barefooted and ill-prepared, I would likely freeze. I could not walk back to the road without my gear, and so I waited, huddled on the edge of the tree line, for the sun to come up, and then, reluctantly, walked back to the tent. The zip remained open, and even approaching, I could see that what I'd seen was not a dream. There was nobody in the tent, but beside my own sleeping bag, still positioned so close that it touched, was another separate bag that had not been there the night before. Where that head and that terrible mouth had been, there was now only a pile of rotted leaves and some hideous, god-awful mulch. The entire thing was covered over with moss and mold, as if it had laid there for many years. I did not unzip to see what was inside, but instead, with a stick, pulled it out and flung it as far as I could. Keeping my eyes on the wretched thing, I packed up my gear and headed back. As you can imagine, I gave up camping after that. Not that it helped. Even at home, indoors in my own bed, far from the highlands and under a duvet rather than a sleeping bag, I still at times wake in a panic, thinking that perhaps I will again find someone beside me, despite having gone to my bed alone. That's all for this edition, kiddies. Be sure to subscribe and tune in next time for more examples of truth being both stranger and more terrifying than fiction. Sweet dreams.